Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 reasons why the Democrats overperformed in the midterm elections last week and why Republicans really dropped the ball in a midterm year that really should have been extremely favorable to them. So we're going to take a look at some of the races in particular, and of course we're going to go through those 5 reasons in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this midterm really surprised a lot of people. Obviously, for Democrats, they were anticipating sort of a blue wave scenario. It really wasn't that surprising. But even some Democrats found this result very shocking because many of them didn't expect the Republicans to do so poorly in the House of Representatives and in the Senate as well. A lot of people thought Nevada, for instance, would be an auto flip for the GOP, among other states. But nobody really got this election right. I certainly didn't. I certainly followed the data, followed the polling in my predictions, which had the Republicans at 53 Senate seats and getting a lot more seats in the House than they currently have. So a number of things happened where the data wasn't exactly correlating with what was actually happening on the ground. So of course, we don't have the final results in. It's been a week since Election Day but Republicans are at 218 seats, which means they will control the House of Representatives very narrowly, Democrats at 212. If we take a look at the Senate, Democrats have 50 seats, Republicans have 49. Senate control will be determined by the Georgia runoff, which we'll make a video about that possibly tomorrow. But this isn't exactly the midterm that a lot of people were expecting. I mean, on the governor level, you had Democrats picking up the governorships in Arizona, Maryland, and Massachusetts. And of course, Democrats held on to the governorship in Pennsylvania. Republicans were really only able to flip the governorship in Nevada. Laura Kelly held on in Kansas. And of course, you had Evers hold on in the state of Wisconsin, among other results. So, very surprising across the board. You had really a red wave localized in certain states, and in other states you had sort of a blue wave. If we take a look at the House map in general before we get into the reasons why Republicans underperformed, if we take a look at the shift from 2020, you'll notice that most congressional districts did shift to the right, and in some cases by nearly double digits. But you'll notice that in some states, swing states really, in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, this red wave really was sort of a red ripple at that. Republicans really didn't do much in terms of increasing their majorities in these congressional districts or in the state legislature, statewide offices. They really dropped the ball in a lot of the swing states. But in safe blue states and safe red states, there was very much a red wave, especially in Southern California and the state of New York, and of course Florida. So you really had sort of localized red and blue waves. You had blue waves in the swing states. You had red waves effectively everywhere else. So really not a result anybody could have predicted. Again, in a lot of blue wave predictions, you would have seen people putting the governorship in New York as safe, for example, so on and so forth. And of course, Florida surprised a lot of people being R plus 20. So with that quick synopsis out of the way, and again, we're going to do more videos sort of covering what exactly happened, some of the trends we can take away from the midterms. We'll get into some of the reasons why Republicans really didn't do so great. And I think the number one reason was messaging. And we actually have some races to compare this to. There's some races across the country where Republicans had very strong messaging. They ran on a strong message. They were able to, create a clear contrast between their Democratic opponents, and a lot of other states where they simply just didn't have a very cohesive message and were really running on vague platitudes of stopping inflation, stopping crime, but really didn't go into specifics. So, areas where Republicans had strong messaging, we could take a look at the governor races first off. In the state of New York, which is a D plus 23 state, Lee Zeldin, the congressman from New York's 1st congressional district, got 47% of the vote in a state that Joe Biden, again, won by 23 points. Donald Trump only got 37% of the vote back in 2020. And he ran specifically on the issue of crime and challenging his Democratic opponent on corruption mainly. The reason why Lee Zeldin was able to make this race so close really was down to the fact that he was able to set the narrative early on that his Democratic opponent, Kathy Hochul, was weak on crime. And that's something he hammered all throughout the state on the airwaves with the money he was getting from the RGA and the Save Our State PAC. And Kathy Hochul, really ran sort of an incompetent campaign. She really didn't get the message until a few weeks before the actual election, where she finally started to address the issue of crime. And because Lee Zeldin was able to hammer in and hone in on crime alone, many voters ignored his record for instance, on the election, the fact that he voted not to certify the election, the fact that, he was a staunch ally of Donald Trump in Congress, voters didn't really care about that because it wasn't really in the media narrative. It was that Kathy Hochul was weak on crime and that Lee Zeldin would keep New Yorkers safe. And because he was so consistent on his messaging, you've seen historic results for Republicans over the past really 20 years in terms of statewide performances. Is definitely one of the strongest statewide performances since at least 2010 for a Republican. So strong messaging won the day in states like New York, states like Georgia. Of course, the state of Florida, where incumbent Governor Ron DeSantis was able to run on his record and his high approval rating and ultimately ended up beating his Democratic opponent, Charlie Crist, by over 19 percentage points, nearly a 20-point margin of victory in a state where just 4 years ago, Ron DeSantis won by 0.4%, or it was something like that. An extremely minuscule margin compared to what we have in 2022. And again, this was down to messaging. Charlie Crist early on wasn't seen as a very strong challenger anyway. Ron DeSantis massively outraised him, and he was able to hone in on a message that Florida was this state where free enterprise was abundant. This was a state that people wanted to move to, and ultimately, this was a state that would foster freedom. And that's a message that really resonated with a lot of not even just conservative Republicans, but independents and even some Democrats across the state of Florida. So strong messaging really helped Republicans. Now, weak messaging, I think, is the reason why Republicans didn't do well nationwide. Republicans talked a big game about crime, about inflation, about these other issues, but they didn't do a good enough job of tying those issues to Democrats. They may have done a good job tying those issues to Joe Biden because Joe Biden's approval rating at the time of this midterm was 39-40%. Yet a lot of these districts and states that barely voted for Biden or even narrowly voted for Trump went to Democrats, partly because of this issue of messaging that Republicans didn't really do a good enough job of tying these perceived failures towards the Democrats. Because normally, again, when you're the out party in a first term midterm for a president, you're expected to do very well. Again, you can go back to 2018. Democrats won the generic ballot by nearly 8 points. They won the House. They did worse in the Senate, but that's a more complicated midterm. We'll talk about that maybe in another video because really the Senate map just wasn't in their favor that time around. But in terms of the election this time around, Republicans did not do a good job of tying Democrats to the issue of inflation. Ultimately, to a lot of voters, inflation in the economy, while it may have been their number one issue, they didn't really see the connection. Republicans failed to connect the dots, especially in the key swing states, and it was certainly at their detriment. Now, the second reason why Republicans did so poorly was candidate quality, and this was something I meant to make a video on back during the election cycle, but Republicans ran a lot of candidates around the country that really weren't compatible with the districts they were running in. I think the number one example to sort of illustrate this is Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. Doug Mastriano ran this really far-right sort of fringe campaign in a purple state. I mean, he really honed in on the MAGA base in particular and really didn't make a concerted effort to sort of branch out to independents and Democrats. And he really was sort of just preaching to the choir with his own voting base. I mean, Doug Mastriano was a very poor fundraiser. He wasn't able to really generate any money on his own. Candidates like him that shared similar views, such as Cary Lake, in other parts of the country, were able to raise lots more money because they sort of had this charisma and this personality about them. And Doug Mastriano really didn't have that. And as a result, he got really colossally shellacked in this election. He lost at this point by over 14 percentage points. This is almost as lopsided as Tom Wolf's re-election victory back in 2018. And, Doug Mastriano, again, really didn't do much to appeal to voters outside of his base. We can also take a look at Cary Lake in Arizona, who narrowly lost her race. That race was called a couple of days ago. This was a lot closer, again, because Cary Lake was a much more formidable fundraiser. She was able to get a lot of attention and dollars to her in a way that Doug Mastriano wasn't. And ultimately, she still came short, and that's mainly because, like Doug Mastriano, she was only really preaching to the choir. She was only focusing on these issues that Republicans and conservative independents really cared about. She talked about the election a lot. She talked about Donald Trump a lot throughout her run. And even to this day, even though she's lost the election, she's still very much staying in that lane in terms of her messaging. And ultimately, it cost her the election because she wasn't able to branch out and reach out to a wider electorate. And I think there was this sort of naive perception, a perception that I sort of bought into a little bit, given some of the data and polling that I was seeing, that these Republicans somehow would be able to win these close races because Republicans would turn out in larger numbers. And while Republicans did turn out in larger numbers relative to other groups, Republicans massively dropped the ball with independents. They lost independents. The first time in decades that the out party in a first-term midterm for a president lost independent voters. I mean, that's a total and colossal failure among the GOP, and part of that's because of messaging, but part of it also is the candidates that are the messengers to go out and campaign on these issues. Again, because Brian Kemp, who was able to campaign on competent governance, conservative leadership in a red state, and again, I'm talking strictly about Republicans, so of course he'd be campaigning on things like that. Florida, same thing with Ron DeSantis, able to campaign on competent leadership, had a strong message. Cary Lake's message really only resonated with the base and really didn't make a concerted effort to reach out to independents who were a bit wary of some of her positions and sort of reassure them. She doubled down on this sort of right-wing firebrand persona, and ultimately it ended up backfiring on her. So again, those are some of the candidates on the statewide gubernatorial level. Of course, you have some of the Senate races as well. Dr. Oz, the Republican nominee out of Pennsylvania, had a number of flaws. His opponent, John Fetterman, was able to define him really early on as a sort of out-of-touch elitist who sort of parachuted into the state to come run for office. And ultimately, despite Dr. Oz doing a lot of campaign appearances around the state, he wasn't really able to shake that narrative off him. He also had problems with the Republican base. Some of the more MAGA fringe members of the Republican base saw him as a liberal or some sort of rhino, and ultimately weren't really excited about his candidacy. And of course, you also had Doug Mastriano sort of dragging down the rest of the ticket. But Dr. Oz wasn't the only one. Of course, you had Herschel Walker, who's had a number of problems himself. He's made a number of gaffes. He has a number of problems as a candidate. Of course, Raphael Warnock is a much stronger candidate, being an incumbent, a charismatic figure. Herschel Walker really doesn't have that going for him. He's had a number of scandals come out about him throughout the campaign. He makes a number of verbal gaffes, which really doesn't help him, and ultimately makes him a fairly weak candidate. Laxalt, I think, was a pretty fine candidate. I mean, he ran probably the best race out of the top 4 candidates in these toss-up seats, but ultimately even he came up short due to the sort of national backlash against Republicans. Blake Masters really wasn't just a good fit for Arizona, very much a Silicon Valley tech sort of nerdy kind of guy. And Mark Kelly, again, was able to run a very strong race on his record about being this moderate independent senator. And whether that's true or not, it was something that resonated with suburban voters and ultimately lost Blake Masters this race because there really was sort of this backlash against Republicans running in a lot of these contested races on abortion and other issues like that. And that's actually a good segue into the next reason why Republicans did so poorly, and that was because of abortion. Now, I've gone a bit back and forth as to whether or not the issue of abortion would be a major factor in the midterms. Early on, I entertained the idea that it would be. And then we got some polling later on in the fall that abortion was really falling out of the attention of a lot of voters, and I ultimately followed those polls and said it doesn't look like abortion is going to be that big of an issue, but at the end of the day, it was. And especially in key states like Pennsylvania, where you had Doug Mastriano essentially saying he would lock up women for having abortions. Again, that goes back to the candidate quality aspect. Really far-right candidate, sort of dragged down the rest of the ticket. Not only cost potentially Dr. Oz the Senate race, but also cost the GOP 3 House races that they otherwise could have won, considering the fact that they were extremely close. Of course, you have Pennsylvania's 8th with Matt Cartwright, Pennsylvania's 7th, and of course Pennsylvania's 17th. These were all races decided by less than 6 points, and these are races that Republicans with a stronger nominee at the top of the ticket could have easily won. But abortion was really a tough issue for Republicans to navigate around, because Republicans are known by general electorate people as the party that is pro-life and is ultimately against abortion, and that's not the popular position nationwide. So a lot of Republicans sort of had to weasel their way around this issue in a way to not alienate their base, but also make it seem like they're the safe choice for pro-choice independents and even some liberals as well. So they really failed on that front. Again, you had Tudor Dixon, Doug Mastriano really made a lot of mishaps with abortion. They said a lot of things very against abortion that really hurt them with the general electorate. And ultimately, Democrats were able to hammer them on it. And of course, you saw in the Michigan governor's race, Gretchen Whitmer winning by double digits. And the main issue of this campaign over everything was abortion. And Tudor Dixon was sort of running this evangelical campaign against abortion in a very pro-choice state overall that very much favors abortion. It certainly didn't help Tudor Dixon that the abortion referendum was also on the ballot. That was certainly done purposely for the general election. And this was something that really clobbered Republicans up and down the ballot. Democrats now have a trifecta in the state of Michigan, and this ballot initiative is part of the reason. Now, the fourth reason why I think Republicans did very poorly during this midterm was that they relied so heavily on election day voting. And this is something you're seeing a lot more right-wing figures start to acknowledge, that Republicans really dropped the ball when it came to mail-in voting and early voting and getting their people out, because the Republican base, whether the Republicans like it or not, is a much more low propensity base than it was back in 2010 or 2014. The Republican Party has moved less away from white-collar suburbia and more towards blue-collar rural areas. And those blue-collar voters tend to vote much less frequently than their white-collar counterparts. And the fact that Democrats are able to pick up more white-collar voters really gives them an electoral strength and advantage, especially in midterm elections going forward. I wouldn't be surprised if in midterms going forward, Democrats will have the advantage outright because their base just votes more. A lot of activist liberals in the Democratic Party treat voting as a religious duty. And you used to have that segment with older Republicans. You really don't see that much anymore, especially given the post-2020 election denialism and the fact that a lot of Republicans simply don't trust early and mail-in voting. And as a result, they all vote on Election Day. So when you have Election Day problems, like in Maricopa County and these other parts of the country where voting machines aren't working, Republicans aren't able to vote, they ultimately end up being disenfranchised. And, that's something that's very preventable if the Republican Party invested in ballot harvesting and early voting. It's something that they've been able to do in the state of California, which is one of the reasons why Republicans were able to flip several seats and hold on to several of their seats in California. 45, 40, these are seats that were flipped in 2020. Youngkin winning by a safe margin, Michelle Steele winning by a likely margin. And some of these other districts, again, Mike Garcia hanging on in District 27, potentially a couple of flips in California. We're still waiting on results out of the 22nd with Valadeo, and of course the 13th with John Duarte. So if they do have these flips, they can be attributed to early investments in ballot harvesting and mail-in voting, because ultimately if the Republican Party wants to win in the future, they have to embrace the playing field that Democrats are sort of put forth around the country, because a lot of Republicans, especially because of Trump and his rhetoric on the election issue, really don't vote in these midterm elections because they simply don't trust the system. And as a result, that's sort of the worst strategy you can ever think of in terms of a political party, because if the head of the Republican Party, and Donald Trump is still very much the head of the Republican Party, is telling his supporters not to vote by mail, not to early vote, certainly going to hurt them, because if you can't vote on Election Day, you just can't vote. If you haven't voted early, there really is no do-over or casting your ballot late after the election. Finally, the fifth reason why Republicans really dropped the ball this midterm cycle is leadership incompetence. And this goes all throughout the Republican Party. From Tom Emmer, the chair of the House Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, some blame goes to Kevin McCarthy. Donald Trump very much involved himself in these primaries, propping up candidates like Cary Lake in Arizona, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, Tudor Dixon, Tim Michels in Wisconsin, which didn't really talk about that one. But, all of these candidates had Trump's backing, and Trump directly intervened on their behalf to help get them the nomination. So that's partly to blame as well. But there was also really a mismanagement of funds. Rick Scott, who is the Republican in charge of recruiting Senate candidates, really spent a lot of money early on these sort of internet ads that really turned out to be a huge flop. And Republicans had a real fundraising issue, and you can kind of sort of tie that into leadership incompetence. They weren't able to raise enough money. Democrats outraised Republicans in most of these races. And again, combined with the other factors, it really was a disastrous midterm for the GOP. And of course, we could talk about some bright spots for the Republicans, but Democrats really had their victory and are taking their victory lap because of the midterms, because they did really well. They won congressional districts they had no business winning in. They made races that were, lean or likely Democrat, safe Democrat in the case of Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. So we saw a lot of surprising results out of this midterm. And certainly as we get into the, lull of the political season, I know Donald Trump announced the other day, but there's going to be a bit of a lull about politics. We'll sort of analyze some of these races more closely and talk about some of the key takeaways from the midterm. But ultimately, again, these 5 issues really handicapped the Republicans and ultimately took away from them an almost assured victory, given sort of the midterm trends and historical trends. And again, that's something I based my predictions on, the polling data and historical trends. That's why I think you really can't find anyone that predicted this midterm accurately, even if they have the right Senate map. A lot of these statewide races, these congressional races, again, if you have Republicans doing worse in the House, you wouldn't have them picking up seats in California or the state of New York. Mike Lawler in New York 17th, which is a Biden plus 10 district. So there's really a lot of specific results we can go into, and you can even talk about specific races, and we might go into specifics in future videos. But that's really my sort of brief synopsis of what exactly happened, why the Republicans dropped the ball this midterm, how Democrats ultimately made last Tuesday night their really big night. So anyway, thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.